So, what things have led to globalization, or what is globalization? It's the spread of information and communications technology. It's a global mass media that is shared very quickly and through many, many different devices. And you can, for example, you can watch the news going on in Thailand and they can watch the news happening here. Cheap airfares has really driven globalization. People now travel much more. The deregulation of the financial markets. So most countries now, the markets are entirely controlled by the businesses. They're no longer regulated by the state. So for example, when in Britain we privatised British Telecom, it's now a private company. National Rail is now a private company. British Gas is now a private company. Those are all organisations that used to belong to the government who regulated them. As a result, all economies are now open up to competition, which is essentially capitalism. And we have increased ease of movement, both of people and money and ideas, okay? And this is particularly important for businesses. Now, there are two different views of globalization. The one on the right, increased interconnectedness, lots of ethnicities missing, lots of mixing, lots of diversity, and it being a very positive thing. Or you have the image on the left where the poorest in our globe are now being stretched even more as they try to produce the lower skilled jobs. Sorry, where they have the lower skilled jobs to produce the goods to fuel a worldwide global form of capitalism. There have been a range of opportunities created because of globalization, and one of them is arms and nuclear material trafficking. Arguably, globalization started to really kick off after the end of the Cold War. Okay, so after the collapse of the USSR in the 1980s. Okay, what's really quite scary is the International Atomic Energy Agency has reported that they've found more than 100 nuclear smuggling incidents since 1993. Many of those nukes and the material to make those nukes can be traced back to the USSR, because when it collapsed, quite a few of its missiles and uranium and plutonium stockpiles went missing. The United States authorities have discovered several Al-Qaeda plots to obtain nuclear materials. And as I said, 50 nuclear warheads are believed to have gone missing during the World War. Now that's a significant amount of destructive power, enough to pretty much wipe out every country on the planet. Trafficking and smuggling of people has become much easier as a result of globalization. Cheap air travel, much more frequent air travel, the European Union, freedom of movement across borders, for example. Sex tourism has been a very sordid byproduct of globalization, particularly going to Southeast Asia, where Western men will travel to sleep with Southeastern Asian prostitutes, particularly children. It's a rampant problem in Thailand, for example. That's an image of Gary Glitter, who hopefully you all know as quite a famous paedophile who left the UK, and he went to Thailand and lived there until the Thai government actually threw him out. Trafficking of body parts is a relatively new phenomenon, arguably only driven by globalization. Okay, this is where this map shows in red the typical donor countries for body parts, and the light blue are the countries that typically buy the body parts. So you can probably tell the levels of wealth differences between those two different types of countries. An estimated 2,000 organs are taken from criminals in China every single year and sold on the organ market. Cybercrime, we mentioned before, which has increased enormously with the growth of things like the internet. Things like identity theft, or most recently stealing trade secrets about different companies and making lots and lots of money on the stock market, is the biggest problem possibly facing our states at the moment, because cyber criminals are miles ahead of any of the materials the police have at their disposal in order to challenge cybercrime. You've got the trafficking of cultural artefacts across national borders, particularly during times of warfare. This can be traced all the way back to, I suppose, World War II, when Hitler quite famously collected together as much art as possible, taking it from all the different countries he took over. This is a rather famous image of a soldier who brought back a bit of Saddam Hussein's arse that was part of his statue, and then tried to sell it on eBay and with that photo. And he was quite quickly after that arrested for stealing a cultural artifact from Iraq during war. Arguably, international terrorism has been a byproduct of globalisation. That is Osama bin Laden, and I'm sure we've spoken about it before in class, but Al-Qaeda initially were actually sponsored by the CIA. They provided them with arms and training in order to try and overthrow the Afghanistan government at the time, which was not open to a capitalist free market. This has pretty much come back to bite them in the proverbial when Al-Qaeda turned its sights on America for its interference in the Middle East, okay? And arguably the attack itself probably wouldn't have been able to occur if it wasn't for the availability of cheap air travel either. Trafficking of endangered species, something that's become much easier as the increased interconnectedness of travel around the globe. And I'm sure you can give plenty of examples to support this point. The drugs trade has increased rapidly. Drugs generally are consumed in Western developed countries. However, they are produced by some of the poorest people in the world in some of the most unstable regions, where actually producing things like poppies is actually the most stable form of income for many of these farmers. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the poppy trade or the opium poppy trade is the most stable form of income in a war-torn Afghanistan. And the people who profit the most out of this trade are the drug dealers and possibly, well, the very much Western drug dealers and the drug users. This is quite interesting that what goes on in Afghanistan is actually affecting like our celebrities, things like Amy Winehouse you could use as a possible example. Financial crimes have increased as the markets have been deregulated. European Union companies for example, have been setting up their headquarters in countries that have got very low corporation taxes, such as Luxembourg, examples of like Google and Starbucks, for example. Financial crimes have certainly increased. Like it's on the news this morning about Credit Suisse. The huge bank is being charged criminally for helping with money laundering, allowing criminals to launder money through their banks. So when they withdraw the money, it is seen as clean and no one can trace it back to the original criminal activity. Arguably, this has happened because of the deregulation of all the markets and the freedom of money across different economies and different nation states. Global risk consciousness is an effect of globalisation, according to BECK. This is when there is a growing sense of anxiety in the West, particularly with this perception that immigrants are flooding to their countries. Now, if you look at some of the headlines on the left-hand side, you can see that the media certainly exaggerates this risk, creating a moral panic. The most recent one being about this apparent floodgate of Romanians that were supposed to arrive on our shores January 2014. They certainly didn't, and a recent study has shown that the number of Romanians has actually dropped since the opening up of the borders with Romania. However, their political leaders such as Nigel Farage of the UKIP has certainly used the threat of immigration as one of his big platforms to gain votes in sort of local European and possibly next year national elections. One of the outcomes of this global risk consciousness is much stricter immigration controls, citizenship tests, for example, restriction of access to benefits. Groups can become targeted on the streets, racism, discrimination in the workplace, hostility, and developing conflict between groups, particularly the indigenous and the immigrant groups. There's much more security control. The state interferes with people's lives on a day-to-day basis to monitor this perceived risk, and we have far more CCTV now. But on the other hand, because of this the growth in risk and the perception of a growth in risk, particularly like the international drugs trade, we now have much more multinational cooperation between countries and trying to deal with things like sex trafficking and drugs trafficking and arms trafficking, which is a positive out of globalisation. Ian Taylor, who's a Marxist, wrote quite extensively about this global capitalism and crime. Now, he argued that international corporations, which are completely obsessed with profit, will move their production elsewhere, where wages are cheaper and health and safety regulations are much more relaxed. This will exploit the poorest people in our world, in third world developing countries, and it will make the contrast between the super rich and the poor even more stark. At the same time as this, right-wing governments have been consistently undermining the welfare state in the West, withdrawing benefits, for example. The Thatcher government in the 1970s and 80s was responsible for that in the UK. The only point for evaluation for this could possibly be that Obama in America has recently tried to roll out health insurance for everyone, but has been met with lots and lots of resistance. Increased marketisation has led to people becoming much more bombarded by choice and this idea of these material goods they should all be buying. And Taylor argued that capitalism has basically led to increased greed because people see all these material images and they want them. And because of this, because of corporate greed, as well as greed and everyday people, there is much more criminal activity within businesses to extend their influence throughout the world. And he said the deregulation, as we mentioned before, has increased opportunities for crimes such as insider trading and tax avoidance. Now, because, as you can see in the image on the right-hand side, in the UK, our working class jobs have now shifted to third world developing countries, we now have some very poor people in our country left with absolutely no opportunities, so they may well choose illegitimate routes to gain financial rewards, such as drug dealing. Green crime is a huge problem across our globe, particularly the issue of dumping toxic or white waste. Okay, so white waste is the example on the left-hand side, like computers and fridges and freezers and washing machines and things that can't be very easily recycled. Companies will pay legal or illegal businesses to transport their white waste to third world countries and dump them there, because you can't dump them in the UK. It's illegal, you must recycle. But it's actually cheaper to transport it to places like India where you can dump it. There are two ways of looking at green crime. The traditional criminology definition focuses on an unauthorized act that breaks the law, whereas green criminology focuses on actions that harm the physical environment even if no law is broken. So they're very interested in ecological dangers and ecological harm. Okay, so even though it's not criminal necessarily to pollute the air, according to green criminologists, it is criminal because you are causing physical harm to the environment and people. So a good example of this, carbon emissions are of the products consumed in developed countries, so the cars that we drive around here, they're actually all built now in third world developing countries like China. And now, so because we consume the products, but the third world developing countries, they have to suffer the carbon emissions produced in the process of making our consumer goods. Okay, should this be considered criminal? Well, traditional criminologists would say no, it's far too vague, you can't, there's no law being broken, but green criminologists would say yes, this is certainly criminal. Now, state crime is quite a difficult type of crime to investigate. The problems being that the state actually owns a monopoly of the instruments of violence, whether it's the police and the army, the secret police, secret service. There are different ways of defining state crime. Some might say it's a violation of human rights, which is Stan Cohen's definition, but arguably this ignores economic exploitation. So surely it's a state crime that we have vast inequality in our society, but, who do you blame? Marxists would be very interested in the fact that it's a state which defines what is criminal and the punishments. So as a result, if a state does do something illegal, they can change the boundaries, they can change the laws to justify their acts and behaviour as being legal, which makes it even more difficult to punish and criminalise state crime. So state crimes are illegal or deviant activities perpetrated by or with the complicity of state agencies, so the government, the army, the police. This can include genocide, like Rwanda, Holocaust, and Germany, war crimes, thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan, torture, remember waterboarding, that was used by the American army up until Obama's administration. Imprisonment without trial, which you can legally do within the UK now if you're suspected of terrorism, and assassination. The American forces assassinated Osama bin Laden last year, so that would be considered a state crime. There are political crimes such as corruption or censorship when they try and manipulate the media. There are crimes by security forces such as genocide, torture, the disappearance of dissidents. Okay, so on your right there's an example of the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, and they march every single year for the 30,000 or so of their children that went missing during the Argentinian dictatorship of Perón. There's economic crimes such as violation of health and safety laws, maybe you can think about Bhopal. Social and cultural crimes such as institutional racism. You might want to talk about France and their banning of the headscarf. And these are all the definitions, the categories used by McLaughlin, who tried to categorise the types of state crime. A good example that's been in the news very recently is the Turkish mining disaster. Now, the reason this is a good example of a state crime is because the mine was recently privatised by the government, which basically meant that the government sold it to a private company for quite a substantial sum of money. The government apparently ignored many of the complaints made about the mines, so in that sense they're complicit. They knew there was something wrong with the mines, but they didn't do anything about it. Apparently the mine owners were actually pre-warned about any annual inspections, so they were able to give a very good impression. And currently there's just over 300 now confirmed dead, and no one's claiming responsibility. Some of the owners have been arrested, but it is very clear who is responsible for this, and that's one of the problems with these sorts of crimes. It's a diffusion of responsibility. Why didn't the state step in and do something about this when they knew that there were very, very serious health and safety concerns at this mine? Israel invaded the Gaza Strip 2 years ago in response to a suicide bomb within Israel. And they used something called white phosphorus, and there's a slide. That's white phosphorus. That is illegal according to the Geneva Convention of Human Rights. White phosphorus will burn your eyes and burn your skin if you come into contact with it. However, Israel denied they used it. Okay. Then they denied that the Gaza civilians were victims. They said that they were armed combatants, and they called them terrorists. And then they argued that the Gaza people actually started it. Now, Gaza is filled with Palestinians. They do not have a military anywhere near as sophisticated as Israel. Israel's military is sponsored by America, so it's a very unbalanced conflict. They were labelled terrorists, the Gazians. They said the Israelis claimed they were only harming terrorists, and here you've got an image of a very young girl who's clearly been killed in one of the attacks. And if you look really closely, this is a picture below a UN school in Gaza. Hopefully you can just about spot the small face underneath all the rubble of the child. However, because Israel, they denied responsibility, they said that they were only targeting military targets and that the Gazians were terrorists, they have never been held to account for these kind of atrocities, and it only happened 2 years ago. Guantanamo Bay is another example, which could be used as an example of the denial of responsibility. The idea that it's not our fault they're here; it's their fault they're here. They shouldn't have attempted terrorism; they shouldn't have planned a terrorist attack. And then there was the torture in Iraq, very famous case. Which the American soldiers who eventually did go to trial for this torture in Iraq, they appealed to a higher loyalty. They argued that this torture was in defence of the free world. Now what you've got there is the Lego version of images that are available online of the actual torture that happened in Iraq, but obviously they're too inappropriate to put into this PowerPoint. Another example of a state crime could be the Cambodia. Pol Pot was a communist dictator in Cambodia, and he was responsible for the systematic deaths in concentration camps, labour camps, in units for torture of somewhere between 1/4 and 1/5 of the population. And these are some of the sites that you can actually visit if you go to Cambodia. I think you remember when we looked at the social construction of deviance. For Pol Pot, they believed that wearing glasses was a symbol of being a member of the intelligentsia and therefore a possible rival to Pol Pot. So anyone wearing glasses ended up in these camps. And finally, another case might be the Vietnam War and the use of napalm, which is like a chemical, almost like tar-like substance that when it lands, it burns right through anything it lands on. It's very sticky, so if it lands on you, it's very difficult to actually get the stuff off and stop it burning you right through to your bones. Here are a couple of short questions that you could attempt to answer on green or state crime. Just to be clear, you won't get any 2 marks, 12 marks or 6 marks questions on this topic, but if you do want to test yourself, that would be great, and I can look at those answers next time I see you.